We often imagine ancient Rome as a majestic picture: white marble temples under blue skies, senators in snow-white togas holding philosophical conversations, and legions stamping their step along perfect roads. It is an image of civilization, order, and law that has left an indelible mark on history. We admire their engineering, art, literature, and dream of being there for a moment. But what if this dream had become a reality? What if you, a modern person, with all your habits, knowledge, and expectations, suddenly found yourself on the streets of the Eternal City in the 1st century AD? Most likely your first day in Rome would also be your last. And it's not about your strength or your intelligence. It's that your whole being, from your immune system to your notions of personal space, is completely incompatible with that reality. Forget the clean, paved streets from the pictures. You would be met with deafening noise, the unbearable stench of rotting garbage and filth, crowds of people jostling in narrow alleys, and the constant, sticky threat of sudden illness, a mugger's knife, a dilapidated house collapsing. Your world of comfort, hygiene, and safety would collapse overnight. And here's the question: would you be able to adapt? Would you have been able to accept the lack of basic hygiene, privacy, and human rights in the modern sense? Would you have been able to find your place in a society where your value is determined by your origins and not by your personal qualities? Stay to the end and you'll learn why Roman cities were biological time bombs, how Roman medicine actually worked, why noise could drive you crazy, how the Romans understood love and friendship, and why even the simplest household habits would make you a completely helpless outsider. The first thing that will kill the romance in you when you step into the streets of ancient Rome is the smell. Not the aroma of freshly baked bread or incense from the temples, but an overpowering, suffocating, nauseating stench. Modern man, accustomed to cleanliness and sanitation, is simply not ready for such a sensory assault. Your brain and body would revolt in the first few minutes. The sources of this odor were numerous. Chief among them was the lack of centralized sewerage for most of the population. The famous Cloaca Maxima served mainly public buildings and the homes of the rich in the Forum. The majority of the inhabitants of Rome, who lived in high-rise insulae, went to the night potties to defecate. The contents of these pots were most often just poured out of the window directly into the street, despite laws and fines. So every step through the narrow, dark alleys was a risk of getting a ladle of sewage on your head. Added to this were mountains of household waste, garbage, food scraps, corpses of small animals. All this was dumped directly on the streets and lay there, decomposing under the scorching sun. There were no special services for garbage removal. The waste was either left to rot on the spot or dumped into the Tiber, turning the river into a stinking sewer. Add to this the smells from hundreds of craft workshops, acrid smoke from the forges, the smell of tanned leather, the ammoniacal perfume from the dye houses where urine collected from public toilets was used as a color fixative. And then there's the smell of the thousands of animals kept in the city, and of course the distinct pungent aroma of garum, a popular fish sauce made by fermenting fish guts. This total insanitation was not just unpleasant, it was deadly. The streets were crawling with rats, flies, and fleas, carriers of the most dangerous infections. Any scratch, even the smallest on the leg, received while walking on a dirty street, could lead to blood poisoning, tetanus, or gangrene. Your modern immune system, unfamiliar with so many pathogens, would have been attacked from all sides. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, diseases that we only know about from textbooks were an everyday reality in Rome. Even trying to clean oneself up would be an ordeal. The water in the public fountains where the poor drank and washed was often contaminated. You wouldn't be able to get through a day without encountering a world of germs that your body simply could not defeat. Rome is a biological bomb for you, and you stand at the very epicenter of it. Forget about spacious villas with mosaic floors and patios. That's the domain of 1% of the population. If you were in Rome, your home would probably be an insula, a high-rise apartment building built of cheap materials and packed to the brim with tenants. And that house would be a real death trap for you. The insulas were built quickly and poorly, economizing on everything. Wooden beams, adobe bricks, flimsy ceilings. These buildings, up to 5 or 7 stories high, were extremely unstable. Collapses were common. You could just go to bed and be buried under the rubble of your own dwelling. Juvenal wrote that in Rome, it was easier to fear collapses than fires, but fires were no less of a calamity. Most insula apartments had no heating, running water, or kitchens. Food was cooked on portable fryers, which became a constant source of fires. Fires spread with lightning speed through the wooden structures, turning entire neighborhoods into ashes. The Great Fire under Nero, which destroyed 2/3 of Rome, was only the most famous of thousands of such tragedies. If the fire had started at night, your chances of getting out of the top floor using the narrow wooden stairs would have been slim to none. Your apartment would be a tiny, dark, stuffy room, often without windows. Privacy was out of the question. Families of several people shared a single room. Often rooms were rented out to several unrelated tenants. Imagine this: you share a small space with a couple of strangers. There is no private corner, no silence. The walls were so thin that you could hear every rustle, every argument, every groan of your neighbors. It was in this cramped space and lack of privacy that special social ties were born. Two artisans or former soldiers who rented a room together became not just neighbors, but partners in survival. They shared expenses, food, and worries. Their households were shared, and this forced closeness often developed into a deep affection that was their only support in the violent city. Their union, not legally formalized, was stronger than many formal marriages. For a modern person accustomed to comfort and privacy, life in an insula would have been psychological torture. The constant fear of collapse or fire, the lack of light, fresh air, and basic amenities, the total lack of privacy, all of these would drive you mad much faster than hunger or illness. Your notion of home as a safe fortress would be shattered on the very first day. If you got sick in ancient Rome, you would have had to rely only on luck and your own immunity, because the medicine of the time would very likely have made you worse. Doctors' ideas about the human body were based on the theory of the four bodily fluids, humors, of Hippocrates and Galen. It was believed that all diseases stemmed from their imbalance. Accordingly, treatment was aimed at restoring this balance. The main treatments were bloodletting, laxatives, and vomiting. Do you have a cold and a fever? The doctor will let you bleed to drain the excess hot blood. You have an upset stomach. You'll be prescribed a powerful laxative that will cause more dehydration. Nobody knew about the existence of germs, viruses, and bacteria. There was no concept of asepsis and antisepsis. There were surgical instruments, scalpels, tweezers, saws, and Roman surgeons were able to perform quite complicated operations, such as removing cataracts or amputating limbs. But it was done without anesthesia. At best, you would be given wine or a decoction of opium poppy to dull the pain a little. Operations were performed with unsterile instruments, which almost always led to post-operative infections and blood poisoning. The chances of dying from infection after a successful operation were enormous. Even a simple toothache became a monstrous problem. They did not know how to treat teeth. The only solution was extraction, which was performed not by a dentist, but by a barber or a blacksmith using pliers, often pulling out the tooth along with a piece of the jaw. The highest mortality rate, especially for children, was the norm. Half of children did not live to be 10 years old. Women died en masse during childbirth from infections and hemorrhages. The average life expectancy, even without taking into account child mortality, barely reached 35-40 years. A person who passed the age of 50 was considered an old man. For you, whose bodies are used to antibiotics, vaccinations, and modern medicines, encountering Roman medicine would have been fatal. Poisoning, appendicitis, pneumonia, any deep wound would have been a death sentence for you. The Roman physician, with his theories about humors and his unsterile scalpel, would have seemed more like an executioner than a savior. You would have realized how fragile human life is without the knowledge we take for granted today. For modern man, food is a source of pleasure, energy, and confidence. In ancient Rome, food was a daily lottery where your health was at stake. The lack of refrigerators and modern preservation methods meant that food, especially meat and fish, spoiled at lightning speed. You couldn't just walk into a supermarket and buy packaged meat. You would have to go to the market, where pieces of beef or pork lay on open counters, covered with flies, dusty and hot. It would be almost impossible to determine the freshness of the product by eye. Often unscrupulous traders masked the smell of rotten meat with spices. If you ate such a product, you were guaranteed to get severe food poisoning. Bread was the mainstay of the diet, but it was not what we were used to. Bread for the poor was dark, coarse, with a lot of bran. When grinding grain, sand, and small stones from the millstones often got into the flour, so that each piece of bread could cost you a tooth. Water was another huge problem. Although Rome was famous for its aqueducts, clean running water was available mainly in the homes of the rich and public baths. The poor took water from street fountains or directly from the Tiber. This water was far from clean. It was contaminated with filth, garbage, and animal corpses. Drinking such water without boiling it was a sure way to catch dysentery or typhoid fever. That is why the Romans hardly ever drank pure water. The most common drink was diluted wine. Even the cheapest and sourest wine had antiseptic properties that made the water safer. For you who are used to clean bottled water, having to drink a low-alcohol drink all day to avoid dying of infection would be a shock. In this culture of shared survival, food and drink played a huge social role. People gathered in cheap taverns to eat a bowl of hot chowder and drink diluted wine. Here at the common table, acquaintances were made. Sometimes two men who had no family became regular companions. They could buy food together, cook together, share expenses. A simple meal together in a world full of dangers became a sign of trust and deep affection, cementing their union stronger than any formal bond. But for you as an alien from the future, every meal would be a game of Russian roulette. Your stomach, unaccustomed to such food and bacteria, would rebel immediately. Constant digestive upset, risk of poisoning and parasites, that's what would be waiting for you at the Roman table. Your body is simply not adapted to such a survival diet. Modern man complains about the noise of the megalopolis, but our noise is the hum of motors and working machinery. The noise of ancient Rome was different. It was a deafening, chaotic, animalistic roar of human and animal masses, from which there was no escape. Silence was a luxury beyond the reach of the vast majority. Rome was a city of 1 million people crowded into a relatively small area. The narrow, crooked streets were packed with people from morning to night. The crowds of pedestrians, the rich men's stretchers carried by slaves pushing everyone in their way, the street vendors loudly hawking their wares, the beggars begging for alms, the cries of children, the barking of dogs. It all blended into a single, maddening cacophony. During the daytime, the movement of freight wagons was forbidden in Rome so as not to create traffic jams. Therefore, all logistics began at nightfall. At night, the city did not fall silent, but changed the nature of its noise. The creaking of thousands of unlubricated wheels on the stone sidewalk, the shouts of the carriage drivers, the swearing of the loaders. This rumble kept the inhabitants of the insulae, whose windows faced the street, awake. The noise of the craft shops, which had been working since dawn, added to it. The clatter of hammers in the forges, the squeal of saws in the carpenter's shop, the monotonous songs of the workers. The city lived and breathed the sounds of labor. You couldn't find privacy and silence even in your own home. The thin walls of the insula let in all sounds. You would hear a baby crying behind the wall, spouses arguing, someone snoring or coughing. Your privacy would be constantly disturbed by the noise of other people's lives. Even the public places gave no peace. In the thermae, baths, there was a constant buzz of hundreds of voices, the splashing of water, the shouting of masseurs and merchants. In the forum, speakers competed in loudness, trying to attract listeners. In the arenas, the roar of tens of thousands of spectators merged with the death cries of people and animals. For you who are used to being able to close the door, put on noise-canceling headphones and be quiet, this incessant soundstorm would be a real torture. Constant noise causes stress, insomnia, and psychological exhaustion. You wouldn't be able to concentrate, rest, recover. Roman noise was not just a background, it was an aggressive environment that would invade your mind and slowly destroy your nervous system. After a few days in this mode, you would be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. We are used to living in a world where there is a police force, a justice system, and a presumption of innocence. In ancient Rome, there was none of that. Order in the city was maintained by force, and violence was an integral part of everyday life. To you who are used to relative safety, the streets of Rome would seem like a battlefield. Formerly in Rome, there were city cohorts and night guards, vigils, but their main task was to fight fires and suppress major riots. They did not investigate domestic crimes. If you were robbed in the street, you had nowhere to go. You could only try to find the offender and take revenge yourself if you had the strength and courage. The streets, especially at night, were extremely dangerous. They were unlit. Dark, narrow alleys were ideal places for robbers and murderers. It was suicidal to leave home after dark without an escort of slaves with torches and guns. Gangs of criminals controlled entire neighborhoods. Violence was also a social tool. A rich and noble Roman could beat or even kill a person of lower status with impunity. If you, a plebeian, accidentally pushed an aristocrat's stretcher, his guards could easily break your bones. Your only chance for justice is to find a patron to stand up for you. The whole system was built not on the law, but on personal connections and power. Punishments for crimes were demonstrably cruel and served to intimidate. The most shameful form of execution was crucifixion, reserved for slaves and the worst criminals. The roads leading to Rome were often decorated with rows of crosses on which people died in agony. Public executions in the arena, where criminals were put to death by wild beasts, were popular entertainment. Even in the home, violence was the norm. The master had the right to severely punish his slaves. The father of the family had absolute power over his children. Street fights were commonplace. You, with your modern legal consciousness and aversion to violence, would be completely defenseless in this world. You don't know how to fight. You don't know how to behave in a street fight. You don't understand the unwritten laws of force. Your faith in justice and police does not work here. Your life and safety would depend only on your own ability to avoid trouble, and perhaps the kindness of a random stranger. But in the cruel world of Rome, relying on kindness was not the best survival strategy. To modern man, slavery is a shameful page of history. To a Roman, it was the foundation on which his entire civilization stood. Slaves were everywhere. They built roads and aqueducts, worked in the fields and mines, served in homes, educated children, prepared food, were doctors and managers. The economy, culture, and everyday life would not have been possible without slave labor. Once in Rome, you would have come face to face with this phenomenon, and it would have been a profound moral shock. You would have seen people being sold in the marketplace like cattle, having their teeth and muscles examined. You would have seen a master beat a slave for the slightest offense. You would realize that a person here can be just a thing, property that can be bought, sold, or destroyed. The slave had no rights. His life and death belonged entirely to his master. Killing another slave was punished in the same way as damaging property. You just had to pay for its value. Slaves could not marry legally, and their children also became the property of the master. The relationship between slaves and masters was complex and varied. In wealthy homes, close ties often developed. A slave manager could enjoy a great deal of trust. A nursing slave could become almost a member of the family. Sometimes there was a deep emotional and romantic relationship between the master and his beautiful secretary, slave, or servant. This love, however, was always poisoned by inequality. The master could give gifts, show affection, but at any moment he could also punish, sell, or kill his lover. Such a reality would be unbearable for your sense of self-worth. As an outsider without papers, status, or patrons, you yourself would be one step away from slavery. You could be kidnapped by pirates or bandits and sold on the slave market. You could be enslaved for debt. And then your modern personality, your knowledge and beliefs would not be worth a dime. You would have to obey, suffer humiliation, and do the dirtiest work to survive. Even if you were lucky enough to remain free, you would have to accept slavery as the norm, interact with slaves, perhaps even buy yourself a slave to survive in this society. Would you have been able to do that? Would you be able to look at another person as your property? It is a moral compromise of which most of us are fortunately incapable. And this rejection of the very foundation of Roman society would make your stay in it impossible. The concept of privacy, which is so valuable to modern man, was virtually non-existent in ancient Rome. The life of a Roman, from a senator to the last poor man, was lived in public. The house was not a fortress, and the body was not an inviolable territory. It all started with the dwelling. As we said, in the cramped insulae, several families or just strangers lived in one room. No private bedrooms, no locks on the doors. Your life was in plain sight. But the main center of social life was thermae. Public baths. It was not just a place to wash. People came here to socialize, make deals, play sports, read in the library, eat and drink. And it was all done together and for the most part naked. Men of all ages and social classes, from senators to slaves, steamed together, swam in the pool, and gave each other massages. For you, with your modern notion of bodily shame, this would be an incredible experience. But for the Romans, it was the norm. The thermae was also a place where all sorts of relationships were formed. It was one of the main venues for dating, including for men looking for partners. Glances, gestures, casual touches in the steam room or swimming pool, it was all part of a complex social game. Here you could meet your future love or just find a one-night stand. Even the toilets were public. In the public restrooms, people sat on long marble benches with holes arranged in rows without any partitions. They held conversations, discussed business, exchanged news, and discharged their bowels in full view of each other. Even the most intimate moments of life, such as birth, illness, and death, were rarely private. The sick person was visited by crowds of relatives and neighbors. The dying person went to the next world surrounded by the whole family. This total publicity, the lack of boundaries between private and public, would be a source of constant stress for you. You would feel naked, vulnerable, deprived of the right to secrecy and privacy. The need to be alone, which is natural for us, would have been an incomprehensible luxury in Rome. The Roman was a social being. His personality was formed and realized in full view of everyone. You, as an individualist, would feel that you are dissolved in this buzzing, curious, unceremonious crowd. We live in a world with social guarantees, insurance, and the belief that tomorrow will be about the same as today. In ancient Rome, no one had such certainty. Life and status were incredibly fragile. One wrong step, one careless word, one change in the political climate, and you could lose everything. If you were a plebeian, your life depended on work, which could be found today and not tomorrow. Economic crises, crop failures, grain shortages, all of these could deprive you of your livelihood overnight. If you owed a moneylender, you risked losing not only your meager possessions, but also your freedom by becoming a debt slave. Your safety depended on having a patron, a rich and powerful patron. Every morning, you as a client had to go to your patron's house to pay your respects and receive a small cash or food ration. If your patron lost influence or died, you were left defenseless. Even for the aristocracy, life was not safe. During the Age of Empire, political struggles were merciless. Emperors suffering from paranoia, such as Caligula, Nero, or Domitian, staged real waves of terror. A false denunciation, a careless joke, a neighbor's jealousy, and you could be accused of plotting against the emperor. This was followed by confiscation of property, banishment, or a death sentence. Your family would be dishonored and your name cursed. Constant civil wars and changes of dynasties also contributed their share of chaos. Legions who proclaimed their commander as emperor could storm into a city and cause massacres and looting. Supporting the wrong candidate for the throne was deadly. For you, who are used to stability and predictability, this atmosphere of total uncertainty would be unbearable. You would not be able to make plans for the future. You would not feel safe. The constant fear of losing your job, your home, your freedom, or your life itself would poison your everyday. In Rome, one had to be not only strong, but also incredibly flexible, cunning and lucky just to stay afloat. You had to be able to make the right acquaintances, anticipate danger, betray and change patrons in time. You, with your modern notions of honesty and integrity, would have been easy prey in this cruel game of survival. Our lives are driven by the clock. We work from 9 to 5. We plan our day by the minute. We value efficiency and speed. In ancient Rome, time flowed differently. Its rhythm was set not by mechanisms, but by nature. Sunrise and sunset, the change of seasons. A Roman's day began at dawn. There was practically no artificial light. Oil lamps gave a dim, smoky light and were expensive. Therefore, all major activity took place in daylight. As the sun rose, the city woke up, shops opened, and work began. The working day for most of the population was long and arduous. The artisan, the builder, the harbor loader, they all worked from dawn to dusk while it was light. The labor was predominantly physical, exhausting, and without any notion of occupational health and safety. A construction worker could fall off a scaffold, a potter could get lead glaze poisoning, a slave in a mine was doomed to a slow death from exhaustion and lung disease. For you who are used to an 8-hour workday, weekends and vacations, this endless cycle of hard work would seem like hard labor. Your body, unaccustomed to such stresses, would quickly give up. The concept of leisure time was also different. After the end of daylight saving time, active life came to a standstill. Those who could afford it dined by the light of the lamps. The poor simply went to bed at nightfall. Entertainment was public and collective. Visiting thermae, gladiatorial fights, or circus performances. The idea of spending an evening alone with a book or watching a movie simply did not exist. Even personal relationships were subject to this natural rhythm. In winter, when the days were short and the nights long and cold, people spent more time together in cramped, heated rooms. It was a time of storytelling, of doing housework together. It was in these dark evenings that two men sharing a room could become especially close, finding warmth and comfort not only by the hearth, but also in each other's company. Your modern perception of time, your need for planning and efficiency would be useless here. You would have to learn anew to live by the sun, to accept the monotony and drudgery of physical labor, to put up with the absence of the entertainment you are accustomed to. You would feel time stretching and becoming viscous, filled not with events but only with the change of light and shadow, heat and cold, labor and fatigue. This alien rhythm of life would break your psyche as much as physical deprivation. So, could you live even a day in ancient Rome? The answer is obvious. The majestic image of the eternal city, created by our imagination, is shattered by the cruel reality to which modern man is absolutely not adapted. It's not a matter of willpower or physical fitness. It's about the total discrepancy between the two worlds. You would have been killed by unsanitary conditions and diseases that your immune system could not cope with. You would be sickened by the unbearable living conditions in dark, overcrowded, and dangerous insulas. You would be driven insane by the constant noise, violence, and total lack of privacy. Your psyche could not withstand the fragility of existence, where life and status could be lost at any moment. The history of Rome is not a frozen ruin. It is millions of human lives full of toil, fear, pain, hope, and love. And after realizing how alien and deadly their world would have been to us, we can only have more respect for their ability to not just survive, but to build a civilization that still stirs our minds today. If you were interested in this dive into the harsh reality of ancient Rome, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments write in what other historical epic you would never want to get and why. After all, each era, no matter how romantic it may seem, hides its own challenges for modern man.